This week, I'm revisiting the stepped, sculptural shape you might remember seeing me throw and trim in a recent video. After going through this whole process, from throwing them to firing them, I've learnt an awful lot. Now, the initial idea was to throw two segments like this, which would then be slipped and scored together with a small hole pierced in the base so that no air is trapped inside, as with no hole when the clay dries and shrinks, it compresses the air inside it, the shape itself distorting as the pressure builds. Also, without a hole during the firing, you're more likely to encounter problems, as if there is any moisture left in the clay and the glaze, it'll accumulate inside, causing the vessel to explode. So instead I'm going to throw a really simple block of clay and trim it out, and then figure out a way of turning the underside to remove much of the excess weight. My aim with these isn't to create the lightest objects. In a way, I don't mind if they've got some heft. If they are heavy and sculptural, they could act as paperweights, or bookends even, objects to look at rather than use. And so for those I'm going to make, I'm simply wedging up an assortment of pieces of clay that approximate the rough shape of the vessels I want to create. And as they're going to be just solid lumps, essentially, this is relatively easy to do. And I make sure the bottom of each is curved. This way, when they're slammed onto the wheelhead, they don't trap any air beneath them. I begin by attaching an MDF bat onto a pad of clay. This way, after the lump of clay has been thrown, I can simply lift the bat away with the pot on top without having to touch the actual lump of clay itself, and marking the soft mass with my fingerprints. Not that that would really matter anyway, considering how much I'm going to be trimming this object. This is probably the most simple thing you can make, as essentially all I'm going to be doing with this lump of clay is centering it and then flattening the walls and the top. I should also mention that I'm not using the softest clay for these. Yes, it would definitely make centering easier, but it would also mean this lump of clay dries out far more slowly, and ultimately that'll be the greatest challenge with these, drying them so they're leather hard practically throughout, which may be sort of impossible. I imagine I'm going to have to dry these as I trim them with the heat gun you just saw. The first thing I did is flip it over, and I left it uncovered like this overnight, and then for all the next day and another night too, until the entire block felt really solid and dry like leather. In hindsight, I should have thrown this block of clay with a V-shaped hollow in the top, as that would have cut down significantly on the amount of trimming I had to do. Thankfully though, I'm a potter that enjoys this process. I began by flattening the top, making sure that it was level. The block of clay was then flipped over and attached to the wheelhead with some slip. I tap center it for a moment, letting the clay and slip underneath rub together, then dry, and it's this that fuses the pot to the metal wheelhead. But for a bit of added security, I do just blend the bottom of the wall like this, sealing this solid block of clay down. And then I do the same for this side. I level the top and straighten the walls, and from this point I can begin hollowing out the center of the lump of clay to create the stepped shape you saw at the beginning. The idea is, if this works, that this will be something that I can scale up quite dramatically to create some rather significant sculptural objects. But I have a fear that things won't go quite as easily as planned, especially with this technique. I need the cross sections of these pots to be even, this way they don't crack as they dry. But there is absolutely no way I'm going to get it right the first time round, and I might have to revert back to one of the other techniques discussed at the beginning. But for now, I'm just going to begin removing material to create a series of evenly spaced steps, beginning at the top and flowing down to the centre. This would be an easier shape to turn on a lathe, as all the trimmings that come off would simply fall out onto the floor, whereas here, the bowl I'm essentially creating will catch them, which means I can foresee a lot of time spent fishing them out. And that will only get worse as the clay itself gets softer, as softer clay is stickier. Because of this, as I trim and get deeper and deeper, I'll occasionally give it a good blast with the heat gun, just to take the edge off the damp clay. I won't film that process, but just bear in mind it's something I'm doing as I'm turning this. This is also the reason I'm not using my tungsten carbide tools, as they don't work particularly well on soft clay, as they're so sharp they catch and drag, and can easily gouge large chunks of clay away. Whereas these steel loop turning tools are a bit more forgiving. They also leave lovely smooth, burnished surfaces, which makes them perfect for turning these steps. This process took about 20 minutes from beginning to end. That's trimming the top alone, hence why I'm speeding up so much of this footage, and really trimming one of these steps is just like turning all the others, so you aren't missing out on much. My other plan with the pots I'm making is to use glazes that really pool and settle on ledges. Essentially, these are canvases for glaze, as all the sharp edges and flat sections will create wonderful surfaces for the glazes to interact over. I burnish the sharper edges with my fingertips, just to make them a bit less keen and susceptible to chipping. With the rough shape there, I spent a further 10 minutes going over each step, making sure the lines were straight and the surfaces were burnished. The next step is to separate this from the wheel head and begin trimming the underside, which is altogether going to be a much more difficult process, I think, as I'm going to have to picture in my mind's eye what this side looks like as I'm trimming the other. And I'm also going to have to be extraordinarily cautious, as trimming any part of this too thin will likely cause it to crack as it dries and fires. But also, if I trim a hole through it, well, then all this hard work was for nothing. I place it down really gently, then softly tap center it, and due to its weight, this piece of clay should hold itself down pretty well. It's low and wide, but as I remove mass from it and it becomes lighter, there is a greater chance it will skid across the wheel head. So I will, at some point, pin it down in place with 3 lumps of soft clay, too. Now, for the underside of this one, I'm going to trim it to have a curved shape, whereas with the other 3 I made, I trimmed those to have a stepped underside. I'm not sure which version I like best, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it when I show them in a moment. Not only will the curve contrast the angularity of the rest of the shape, but I was thinking in terms of actually keeping this portion of the wall relatively even is probably the easiest method, as when trimming steps on the underside, it's insanely difficult to trim in such a way that it mirrors the steps on the top of these. In a way, I'd like to hollow out the underside of each step, if that makes sense, but that is far easier said than done, whereas by trimming a curve, as long as I follow the rough slope of the steps on the inside, the wall should remain relatively even in cross-section, despite there of course being some thinner and thicker bits. I filmed this on a Thursday, by the way, which explains the jazz you're hearing in the background, as my neighbours jam away for a few hours. I quite like how the underside looks like a bowl. Let's just hope it survives drying and firing without any cracks. The last thing I'm going to do is just burnish that top edge one last time to clean away any scuff marks left over from when this portion of the pot rubbed against the wheel head. And that's the 4th one of these finished. I'll be wrapping them up in plastic, this way they shouldn't crack as they dry slowly. It's about a week later, and I just want to check in on them to make sure they're drying okay. Here's the one you saw me make in the video. It's the widest of these shapes, but I think in hindsight I should have made it taller, as its shape does make it somewhat reminiscent of a type of pot I really don't want this object to be. I'm sure you can guess. The next one is taller and with smaller steps, and it also has a stepped interior. I think I prefer the narrower steps, but Christ, trimming the underside of this was a real challenge, as I was constantly having to flip it over in order to feel the cross section. But even then, there's only so much information you can take in. The next one, yes, has a hole in it, because, well, I did exactly what I mentioned earlier. I trimmed right through it, but in actuality, I maybe preferred this version more, which is a real shame, as when I checked this piece 2 or 3 days later, this is the crack I was met with, which means this one was immediately smashed to bits, the clay recycled. But I think when I create a batch of these next, when I have a second attempt, I'll lean into these wider shapes with holes in the middle. And lastly, there's the taller, narrower version, that again I really like, but trimming the underside of a shape like this is horrible, as I was constantly fishing out all those ribbons of clay, but I welcome a bit of hard work if it results in an object I love. So, the next step for these will be drying them out really slowly over a week or 2, which, as we've already seen, didn't work out particularly well for one of these. Drying pots slowly prevents them from warping or cracking, generally, but sometimes with certain pots there is practically nothing you can do. Once they had turned completely bone dry, I packed them into my electric kiln to be bisque fired. This changes fragile clay into hard ceramic, and after the pots have undergone this change, they can no longer easily be recycled, which is why if something has cracked at the bone dry stage already, I never fire it, as it's simply a waste of clay. And if something is cracked at the bone dry stage, generally speaking, it's only going to get worse after being bisque fired. And here they are, the 3 stepped survivors. At first glance they looked okay, but upon closer inspection, yep, you guessed it, 2 of them had cracks in the base. I think in both cases it was because I left the clay too thick on the very lowest portion. So, note taken, but that does now mean I just have 1 left in order to get this right. Yes, it's wasted clay, but as a bonus it does mean I can smash these apart in order to see the cross section. And wow, it's really not as good as I thought. It's way too thick in places. I think next time I'll either have to spend far longer trimming, or make shapes that are simply more accessible, so that I can reach the turning tool in more easily and actually see what I'm doing. Or try throwing them as 2 components. This piece was really thin at the top, which I'm surprised didn't cause a crack, but again the bottom half is, well, just far too heavy. That puts everything on this one. No pressure. At least my curved underside idea worked, perhaps, but at the end of the day I don't think I can really make any judgment considering I only made 4 of them, each being considerably different from the last 2. The next step in the process is to wax the underside to create regions where the glaze won't be able to coat it, such as the foot around the outside for instance, or the portion in the centre where my maker's mark is stamped. This is basically just a very simple wax resist, which means when the porous pot is dipped in glaze, the water, which all the raw materials that make up the glaze are mixed into, cannot be absorbed through this layer of wax, and therefore the mixture of raw materials can't adhere to the surface. And you don't have to worry about removing the wax afterwards, as it simply burns away in the kiln, leaving absolutely no trace. I then grip the vessel with a pair of tongs and submerge it into the glaze. This is that mossy green colour I've been using lately, which pools wonderfully into thicker bands of green, so it should work on this shape very well. It also tends to go on thinner, and in a more even layer too, so I shouldn't have to spend too much time tidying the glaze up afterwards. Apart from that raggedy band you can see around the base. It's now the following day, the glaze has dried, and it's at this point that I'll clean over the tongue marks and scrape away any other inconsistencies in the surface. I don't mind if some of the glaze is thicker on the actual steps, where it'll melt and settle into itself, but on the walls I want it to be relatively flush all the way round. And throughout this process I work over a basin of water that catches much of the glaze dust, and eventually, once this is relatively full, I can recycle this glaze back into the larger bucket you saw me dip the pot into. I then very carefully place it upside down on one of Diamond Core Tools' sticky pads. This way I can easily wipe clean the foot all the way around, which is much easier than trying to do this by, say, holding the pot with my left hand and trying to sponge the foot clean with my right hand. You just have to be confident that you won't chip the glaze on the top of the pot as you place it down. This process of cleaning up the surface of the pot is something I repeat hundreds of times, usually in the space of a week or 2. The stepped vessel is then placed into my Rohde KG-340 gas kiln for its reduction firing to cone 10, which is about 1290 degrees Celsius or 2354 degrees Fahrenheit. The rest of the kiln is filled up really densely, as the more pieces I can fit inside, the more cost effective each firing is. The kiln is lit the following morning at 7 o'clock, whereupon the temperature is very gradually increased. I do this by simply turning up the gas. At about 600 degrees, I turn on my air compressor, and then at 860 degrees, I initiate what's called the reduction atmosphere. This is done by sliding the damper to be half closed and by dramatically increasing both the gas and air pressure. As the temperature rises and the climb begins to stall somewhat, I gently tap the dampers to be more and more open, lessening the strength of reduction and allowing more air into the chamber, which lets the temperature rise. At 1290 degrees Celsius, or when cone 10 is touching toes, the kiln is switched off. And from this point, it takes about 2 days to cool down fully. I open the dampers, take the bungs out the spy holes and crack the door open. I really hope the stepped vessel survived, but truth be told, I haven't got my hopes up. And it did it, I think. But I'll quickly sand the base before I have a real look. I've been using these Diamond Core Tools diamond pads for this process, but their edges are starting to peel. Maybe I get them too wet. And my aim isn't to sand them to the point that they're glassy smooth, as doing so removes the colour the clay is given through the reduction firing process. Instead, what I'm doing is removing the coarse particles of grit that are left, that would otherwise scratch whatever surface it's placed on. Its colour really changes depending on the light you're looking at in, but it worked. Wonderfully, I think. the glaze has pulled on the steps fantastically, creating darker bands of colour. There's a strange indentation though on the wall that surrounds it. I must have trimmed the wall thinner here, as I can feel a very subtle indentation, and you can almost just about see it in the glaze too. And, well, that's when I saw it. A tiny crack on one of the lowest steps. It doesn't go all the way through the wall, it's surface level, and the glaze has just about covered it in a watery layer. But it's there, regardless, which means that 0 out of 4 made it. How annoying is that? To be so close, but so far. At least I've learnt a lot for when I attempt these next. And I know what I'll have to improve. Thinner walls, maybe made in 2 parts, and more curved undersides, like this. For now though, I'm going to leave you with some photographs I took that show the object in a better way, I think. Also, let me know what you think, and if I should make larger ones of these, perhaps in various other glazes too. Really, there's so much I can try. Anyhow, thank you so much for taking your time to watch. It means a lot. Also, for those of you who've made it this far, I'm going to be updating my online shop on the 24th of November at 7 PM GMT. You can find more information on my website and on my Instagram. And, as always, I'll see you next week.